Hello. Here is a draft log of Jump to Lightspeed draft that we did at Zulu's. I flashed the leader draft, but full disclosure, kind of fucked up here. Didn't really pay that much attention and made like some crucial mistakes in the leader draft. Looking back on it, I definitely should have picked Rose over Vader for my first leader pick, but ended up with Vader Thrawn. I picked Vader, the second leader pick, to like cut the guy to my right from having a villain. So I kind of purposely villain locked myself in hopes to keep villain super open being past me. And let's see if that worked out. Here we see pack one, pick one. I'm going to be narrating my final pick decision as opposed to what is being shown on the screen. But it ended up being between Captain Tarkin and Out the Airlock. I ended up choosing Out the Airlock because I had Thrawn as one of my leaders, and I thought picking a blue removal card would be staying a bit more open than picking Captain Tarkin. I think Tarkin is a better card in a vacuum, but I thought picking a card with the same color as my leader was staying more open. I feel like Tarkin kind of locks me into Vader, but blue-red with Thrawn would probably be perfectly fine. Pick two, we're immediately getting punished for being villain locked, as there's going to be some pretty good hero cards towards the end of the pack. I thought my decisions here were between the 2 resource 2/3 in blue and yellow electromagnetic pulse and the 4 resource 4/3 sentinel in space. I ended up opting for the blue 2 drop with the same idea as my first pick, in that sticking with blue just kind of kept me more open. It's not that the Squadron Brute is a bad card by any means. It's just not the power level I think you are hoping for a pack 1 pick 2. Pick 3 is a bit more interesting. We see landing shuttle and dorsal turret here. I opted for dorsal turret because I think it's the better card and it synergizes with Vader's make a 1/1 TIE fighter pretty well, and it's playable in Thrawn for sure. Landing shuttle, I'm hoping at this point that I'll see a lot more of them, and I think people will take dorsal turret more than they take landing shuttle. Pick 4, we end up in our third color when we see a Mandalorian later in the pack. I am really high on the Mandalorian. I think he's an amazing pilot. Getting to exhaust something and adding 3 power lets you be really aggro, and playing him for 7 to like stave off a lethal ground attack late game is pretty relevant in my opinion. I'm really happy to see him here. Our next pick is not as exciting as our previous one, but I think the debate was between this 5 resource 4/7 in space in blue and the Star Hopper 2 resource 2/3 in yellow. I opted for the 2 drop because we just picked a yellow pilot that we really want to play, and the when defeated on the Star Hopper synergizes pretty well with Thrawn. Continuing with the theme of good yellow cards, here we see a Razor Crest. We also see Focus Fire, Chimera, Squadron Brute, and Dorsal Turret. So to me, this was a turning point in the draft. I'm really high on Razor Crest, and that's what I ended up picking here. But I think if I really wanted to lean into the Thrawn theme of when defeated, a Chimera would have been quite good, as it allows you to double trigger your when defeated when you play the Chimera. We can talk about this pick later, as I think it has a lot of implications for how my deck ended up turning out. But I really wanted to play Mandalorian, and therefore I picked the Razor Crest. Here we see a Desperate Commando and a Barrel Roll. I think Barrel Roll is really good, but it shines in aggro decks. And I think Desperate Commando is probably what Thrawn wants to be doing, as it locks up the ground, lets you -2/-2 if you can run the commando into something. So I'm pretty happy to pick one up here. The thought process for the rest of the draft was that I need pilots because I really value my Razor Crest. And Trace here is a perfect example of a cheap pilot that I would be happy putting on my Razor Crest at 1, allowing me to, have a good 5 resource play. I think Grim Valor and Skyway Cloudcar are okay. I'm hoping to see them later on in the draft, so I think picking the uncommon 1 resource pilot is a little bit better than picking one of these probably filler cards. My next 2 picks are not super exciting. The next pick, it's a pretty obvious CR90 Relief Shuttle. It's a perfectly fine 6-drop, allows me to try to stabilize a little bit. And then the pick after is between the 1-2 Sentinel pilot and the 4-3 Sentinel. I'm not a huge fan of the 4-3 Sentinel because I think a lot of turn 3 plays can trade into your turn 4 play pretty easily since it only has 3 toughness. So I ended up picking the 1-2 Sentinel pilot. My last few picks aren't super exciting. I pick up an Independent Smuggler next, which I'm happy about since it's a 1 resource pilot that can go on Razor Crest, even though it's kind of an aggro card. And then my last 3 picks are more or less throwaways, with maybe playing my last pick of Quasar TIE Carrier. Here we see what my mental image of the deck looks like currently. So I have 4 pilots, 1 piece of removal, and 3 2-drops already, which is great, and kind of the Razor Crest, the highlight of the deck so far, in my opinion. Maybe a bit of a spoiler alert, but I think overall the pack is indicative of how the deck turned out, and there's a little bit of this identity crisis that occurred. I'm not really leaning into the Thrawn ability, or really like this control deck that I think Thrawn needs, but we'll see how the draft turns out later. Alright, pack 2, pick 1. We see a Razor Crest, a Chimera, an EMP, and a Shiny Luke. After asking around for how much value the Shiny Luke is, I opted for the Razor Crest. I already have 4 pilots. I was really happy about my first one. Surely a second one will be good. If I was drafting more towards Thrawn, I think Chimera would probably be the correct pick, but more on that later. Continuing with the trend of weak pick 2s, here we see a Sith Trooper, a Heavy Fighter, and a 5 resource 5/5 in space. I opted for the 3 resource 3/3 on ground. I think I just value early plays more than later plays, especially in such an aggro heavy format. And I'm not sure the 5 resource 5/5 is what my deck really wants to be doing. Due to the amount of pilots that I have and the 2 Razor Crests, I imagine my 5 resource turn is going to be deploying a pilot on a Razor Crest or some other unit and playing like a 3 or 4 resource card. Here we have a pretty stacked pack. We have the Techno, what's its face, 5 resource 4/6 shielded in space, Fleet Interdictor, Director Krennic, and Corvus. I ended up picking the Fleet Interdictor here. I think it is the one thing that allows Thrawn to stabilize 6/6 Sentinel, even though it's super late. If you can survive up to the point, there's not a lot of things that give Saboteur in the format in space aside from that 1 yellow leader. So usually it's kind of what you're building up towards. I think if I drafted the draft differently up to this point, Krennic probably or might have been the correct pick, as 2-drop that kind of makes the rest of your deck cheaper seems really strong. But here we are with 2 Razor Crests and a bunch of pilots and not that many when defeated cards, so Fleet Interdictor is the pick here. As we go into the next pack, we see a corporate cruiser, shuttle, and Boschek. I picked the landing shuttle here. I think the light cruiser is like a pretty good 6-drop since it's proactive with its ambush, but at some point I need to pick some when defeated triggers, and I think the 3 resource 2/4 shuttle draw a card is like kind of what Thrawn wants to be doing. You can like put a pilot on it or use the +2/+0 attack with a vehicle on it and kind of 2 for 1, 2 for 2 yourself, but then you get to draw 2 cards, so the card trading like goes in your favor theoretically. Next, I'm really happy to see this Death Space Cruiser, the 3/3 in space that exhausts if you have another space unit. I think it's really good. Yeah, that's all that needs to be said. Next pick, we later see a Punch It, the +2/+0 attack with the vehicle. It's kind of what I want to be doing with my landing shuttle, so, and I'm just happy to pick one up. I think it's a pretty good card you're always happy to have one of. The Tide Dagger Vanguard is, I think, a medium card. It's probably decent in Vader or, an Asajj deck, but here in my Thrawn deck, I'm not sure how often like I'll be doing indirect damage or running like random things into my opponents, or them having to hit one of my Sentinel units and then me able to finish them off with the 2 damage ping. So I just think it's a little bit weaker than the cheap 1-drop trick. And then the 3 resource 2/3 Sentinel, I think the 3 toughness really does itself some disservice, as you want your Sentinel units to take more than 1 action for your opponent to kill, and there's just too many like 3-drop space units that have 3 power that can clear it in 1 attack. And worst case scenario is like your opponent plays the 2 resource 3/2 in space and you're just sad. None of these cards in the next pack are very good. I think it's kind of like a sideboard card pick. I opt for the Interceptor Ace. This thing costs 3 to pilot, which makes me really sad, but I think if you come up against a lot of indirect damage, it's probably a sideboard card you're pretty happy with. The 6 resource 4/4 give 2 fringe units shielded Sentinel. I think the fact that it's on the ground just makes it too situational, and the Guerrilla Soldier is just not really what my deck wants to be doing. Here we see a Mist Hunter. I'm pretty happy to pick it up as just like a good space unit for me to put a pilot on, and I felt like I would get incidental value with how many pilots I planned on running for my 2 Razor Crests, so happy to pick it up. Next 2 picks aren't too tough. Chimera is really the only pick in this pack, and then the next pack is kind of a dud. I opted just pick up a 2 resource exhausted unit, but the next pack, I think I made a mistake here. I did the decision between 5 resource 4/6 with a shield, Corvus, and sweep the area. I mulled on this pick a lot because I think the 5 resource 4/6 shield is really hard to deal with. It's just like super annoying. But in hindsight, I kind of wish I picked the Corvus. I had a lot of pilots with Razor Crest, and the ability to like strip a pilot off the Razor Crest and then play another pilot on the Razor Crest after Corvus is probably quite good, and the restore is not negligible. And if you are attaching a pilot to Corvus when you play it, it's probably just as annoying to deal with the Corvus with a pilot attached as it is to deal with the Union transport. And both of them probably die to the same pieces of removal at the end of the day. You also get to re-trigger some of your pilot attach abilities, which unfortunately the Mandalorian does not count, but I think I had picked up one or two of those at this point. So yeah, I really do think I should have picked the Corvus here. Last few picks, we have a land speeder and 2 cards I'm not playing. My deck kind of looks like this right now. I think it's coming together. Like, we're still definitely centered on the Razor Crest play pilots. We picked up a little bit more win defeated cards, including our first Fleet Interdictor, so I'm pretty happy about that. Looking back at it, I do think the deck is a little bit top heavy right now, because if you think about our turn 5 or resource 5 play, assuming we have a Razor Crest out, we're probably paying 1 or 2 for the pilots, and we're going to want to pick up more 3 and 2 drops to have a second play on that turn. I also think we're lacking removal, like direct hits. We haven't seen a single one of them, and if you're playing a control-y value deck, you definitely need them. Alright, pack 3, pick 1. We open up and we quickly see a Fleet Interdictor. Nothing else really in the pack to think about. There's a 5 resource, 4/6 shielded at the back, but Fleet Interdictor is definitely the pick here. Going along with our theme of weak pick 2s, we look at the pack and we see a Desperate Commando. Not a lot of options here for us, so it's kind of a pretty sad pick 2. Pick 3, we see a Silver Angel, the hover tank, and then towards the back we see the Tam pilot. I opt to pick this as it's just a pilot that goes on Silver Crest, and the ability seems quite annoying for my opponents to deal with. But I think at this point it's probably pretty close. Like, I do want more 2 drops in space. Here we have a choice between Landing Shuttle, the 3 resource Jump Master with Sentinel, and a Chimera. I end up picking Chimera here because I thought I needed more top end, but in hindsight, I do wish I either picked the Shuttle or the Sentinel. I think I wish I picked the Sentinel. My deck was top heavy, and I just didn't have that many good win defeated triggers for the Chimera. So I do think this pick here is a mistake. Here we have a Cloaked Star Viper. I think it's just pretty clearly the pick, especially with how many pilots I have. A 3/2 double shield, and you slap a pilot on it. Seems super annoying to deal with. Next pick, it's my second out, the Airlock. It's a no-brainer. I need removal, and it's by far the best card in the pack. And then the pick after this, I was debating between this Skyway Cloud Car, Cat and Mouse, and I Have You Now trick. I opted for I Have You Now, kind of thinking that, like, hey, I'm going to have these ships with pilots on them, and it would be nice to get multiple attacks out of them. But I actually never ended up playing it. I kind of wish I picked the Cloud Car just to have like another thing that a pilot could sit in, even though it's locked to the ground. I'm really unsure of like how good this win defeated trigger is, because how often are you going to be running into things like with power 2 or less in the mid to late game? So I'm not entirely sure if like the win defeated trigger even counts as an upside on the card, but I think something for a pilot to sit in on the ground probably was better than I Have You Now. Next pick, nothing to write home about. It was a debate between covering the wing and barrel roll. I need 2 drops, so I opt for covering the wing, which can just be, 2 resource 2/2 in a pinch, and in the mid game, adding a shield onto something is great. And then this next pick is definitely a mistake as well. I opt for the pilot because I'm still in the mindset of, I need pilots for my Razor Crest. But I think I should have opted for the 04 2-drop in space just for something my pilots can sit in. Because looking back at how the deck turned out, I was just kind of lacking 2 drops. I'm not a huge fan of the 04. I think the indirect damage is often a liability since your opponent gets to choose it unless you go all in. But I guess there is something to be said for slapping the 1/1 raid 1 pilot on it and turning it into a 2/5 or something. Last 5 picks, I picked up another pilot for 1, which I was happy about, and a Heartless Tactics, and then an ATRT to shore up the ground. So these 3 ended up making the deck, but I was never playing the Frigate or the last pick TIE Fighter. This is how the deck turned out. I'm pretty happy about the Razor Crests and the number of pilots that can technically go on it, and the 2 Fleet Interdictors. However, I think that I lack interaction, obviously, since we only have 2 out the airlocks and no direct hits, and the top end is a little bit too toppy. Like, if I could change out, a 5-drop and a 6-drop, and even like a 2 of the 6 drops for just like solid cheaper ships at 2 and 3, or if I get greedy, a direct hit or 2, the deck would have turned out a lot better. Of course, I guess I can't really cut that many vehicles since I'm running 5 pilots and have 3 pilots in my sideboard, which is the thing that's rotated up there in the top right. But I think this is also like the natural awkwardness of pilot decks in the format where you have card slots that are pilots and card slots that need to be vehicles for the pilots to sit in, and unless you're playing like Poe in Hero Green, very rarely does the singular card represent optionality for this choice. So if I had to give this deck a rating, I think I would give it a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 before playing it. At least that's what I thought going into my matches. At Zulu's, we play 3 best of 3 matches, and the deck ended up going 1-2. I ended up facing 1 mid-range deck in Rio, and then 2 aggro decks in Luke and Major Von Reg, which were always going to be tough for Thrawn to deal with, but I think due to the lack of cheaper removal and direct hits, my build suffered. But let's go into, I think, where the deck went wrong. So, point 1. Is Razor Crest good when your leader cannot pilot it? I think my experience with Thrawn and Razor Crest points towards no. Don't get me wrong, I think it's still a solid card, but the 5 leaders you see pictured here all can pilot Razor Crest either the turn you play it on the 4 resource turn or the immediate next turn on the 5 resource turn. And this is really relevant because it's early on and you can often threaten to bounce just played 4 resource unit that your opponent has played. I know Luke and Vader obviously deploy as pilots, but since they're at 6, it's a little bit worse in my opinion because there isn't a guarantee that you can bounce that 4 resource unit that your opponent just played, which is I think what makes Razor Crest so backbreaking. if you're staring down at your opponent who has Razor Crest and Von Reg as a leader, and you have 4 resources to play, like, you kind of know that if you spend your whole turn, they're just going to time walk you by deploying Major Von Reg on Razor Crest and bouncing what you just played. And that's a real feels bad moment. Another thing to note is that when your leader ends up being a guaranteed deploy for free onto the Razor Crest, or I guess in Pope's case just for 1, it makes your resource 5 turn a lot less awkward. Since I was playing Thrawn, if I started the game with Razor Crest, then I would always have to try to keep a cheap pilot around to take advantage of it the turn after I played Razor Crest, and that often led to awkward turns where resourcing could be hard since I needed 2 cards to take advantage of that 5 resource turn. Whereas, like, if you had a leader that guaranteed the deploy onto Razor Crest, then you can kind of resource out of your hand a little bit easier since you don't technically need a 2-card combo to take advantage of all 5 resources the subsequent turn. I think this segues into just like the philosophy of the draft we just watched. I focused a lot on picking both Razor Crest and then subsequently picking pilots so I had something to play on it. And this kind of like derailed the draft a little bit. I think looking back on it, if I didn't focus that much on Razor Crest but ended up picking up like more win defeated synergy, maybe the deck would have ended up better. And to figure that out, let's take a look at Thrawn. When I look at Thrawn, the biggest downside for sure is the inability to deploy as a pilot. As a blue leader, you naturally lean towards mid-range and control, and a lot of times your game plan is try to figure out how to stabilize against the more aggressive decks. In previous sets, the leaders in those aggressive decks always deploy on the ground, and they would deploy maybe 2 turns ahead of you, get a hit or 2 on the base, or if they're playing more mid-range, clear a unit of yours or 2, and then eventually you can deploy your leader, and your leader was guaranteed to be able to stabilize, or at least attempt to. But in JTL, this dynamic is different now because the aggressive decks, their leaders are deploying as a pilot, and they're making these giant space units that Thrawn just can't interact with. So if you're about to die in a hit or 2 to their leader's spaceship, it really doesn't matter what your leader does if they can only deploy onto the ground and can't meaningfully interact with the opposing leader unit. I think this segues pretty naturally into evaluating Thrawn's ability of doubling when defeated triggers. Here we have all of the cards that have when defeated at common and uncommon on the screen. I think it's pretty obvious that Fleet Interdictor definitely has the best when defeated ability. As Thrawn, if you get to double trigger that and destroy 2 of your opponent's space units at 3 or less, like, you're feeling pretty happy. The next most powerful ability is probably Desperate Commando, giving a unit -1/-1, and therefore with Thrawn -2/-2. I think Commando is pretty situational. If your opponent has a ground unit that you can trade with Commando, and then you can also finish something off in the space with -2/-2, that's going to obviously feel super amazing. But there's another situation where you play Commando and your opponent is only playing space units, and you actually have no way to kill off the Commando and trigger the when defeated. You're probably going to feel pretty bad. And with Commando only hitting for 2, it's not like your opponent feels pressured to deal with it. So then we take a look at the other units. I think all of the heal from bases are just generally pretty good. You know, the format's really aggressive, so healing for 4, healing for 6, like similar to Cargo Juggernaut from the earlier sets, is never going to be bad. Before we get to Landing Shuttle, let's take a look at the other colors. You know, red and yellow have indirect damage. Doubling indirect damage is never really a bad thing, but I'm of the opinion that indirect damage is good only when you have a ton of indirect damage. Otherwise, your opponent just gets to distribute in the best way possible for them, and you're never really getting like high impact from it. You know, like it doesn't matter if they put 6 indirect damage to base if they're going to outrace you. Skyway Cloud Carb, I think this ability is a little bit suspect. There's not a lot of 2 power things that you feel great about bouncing. Yeah, like if you snipe the occasional 2 drop, you're probably fine. The best card that you can bounce is probably the 3 resource 2/4 with Sentinel in space, or the 2/3 Sentinel in space. But I think it's pretty rare that the ability is going to make a difference. Ambush Squadron, you know, there only being 1 green when defeated, I think you're probably rarely going to be Thrawn green, but I guess it's kind of nice that it could make 2 1/1 tokens. Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical there. And then with the shuttle villain card, I think that seems pretty good, but I'm not really sure how many token upgrades are going to be floating around. Maybe you're playing against blue and you can snipe like 2 shield tokens from your opponent, or you know, move 1 shield from theirs and 1 shield from the shuttle, and you're pretty happy. Okay, speaking of shuttles, let's go back to the Landing Shuttle. I think in a vacuum, 3 resource, 2/4 space, draw 2 cards when defeated seems great. I think the problem is card draw good in the context of the format, aka what is Thrawn trying to do? And I think the answer to that is survive. If Thrawn can stabilize in the late game, hopefully and/or generally, you should be able to come over the top against your aggressive opponents. But to get there, you have to answer the question of, how do I kill my opponent's leader pilot? You know, these are things coming out as early as turn 3 that could be a 7/7 or a 7/8 or a 7/10. And how do you answer this? Because if you don't, you're probably going to die. So going back to taking a look at the when defeated triggers, we need to ask ourselves, do any of these triggers being doubled help us answer this? Fleet Interdictor, obviously, you know, if they deploy their leader on a 3 space unit, it blows it up. But aside from that, really the only thing that affects the board in a meaningful way is the Desperate Commando. Otherwise, you know, you're healing your base, which is fine, and you're drawing cards, which, you know, if you draw into, let's say, out the airlock or your Fleet Interdictor, that's kind of helping you answer their giant space leader. Indirect damage is probably unlikely going to help because they probably will just put it on their base because they're killing you faster because they're hitting you for 7 through 9 into the air. The point I'm getting at is, when it comes to Landing Shuttle, I think drawing the 2 cards is going to feel great if you draw into an answer that helps you solve this problem of how to kill the space leader. I know it's sounded pretty pessimistic, but I think uh, Thrawn's game plan essentially boils down to get Fleet Interdictor out and pray. Um, Fleet Interdictor with Thrawn's ability is the de facto way to stabilize. If you get Fleet Interdictor out and your opponent kills you anyways, you were never winning the game, right? So you can kind of reframe the problem of how to kill your opponent's space leader unit more into how to survive until Fleet Interdictor. And then these win defeated triggers kind of look a little bit better, right? Like the win defeated healing actively helps you get to turn 6. Landing shuttle can actively draw you into exhaust cards, which yellow, which I do think is one of the stronger colors in the format, has a lot of. You can imagine all of these yellow cards as just saying delay the giant hit from the enemy space leader by 1 turn and get you 1 more resource closer to Fleet Interdictor. The last card I want to talk about is Chimera. I think when you look at this card, it seems very obvious that it's a Thrawn card, but let's take a look at Chimera in the context of all of the other win defeated cards we just evaluated. You'll notice 2 things. 1, Chimera comes out before or on the same time as the more impactful ones of Heal 3 and Fleet Interdictor, right? Then you take a look at, okay, what do I want to have double trigger when I play the Chimera? The best case scenario is Desperate Commando, right? If your Chimera says, when played, give target unit -2/-2, you're probably pretty happy for that being your 6-drop. I think by the same lens, if your 6-drop says, when played, heal 4 from a base, you're probably fine. However, I think if your 6-drop says, when played, draw 2 cards, or when played, deals 6 indirect damage or 4 indirect damage, in the context of surviving until Fleet Interdictor and /or how do I kill the enemy's space leader unit, that seems a lot worse. Then you ask yourself, is it really realistic that my Desperate Commando and my Squadron Brute have survived until turn 5 for me to double trigger off of Chimera? I think if you're not dying to an aggro deck and your 2-drop is alive for 4 turns, you're probably in a fine position, right? In most aggro matchups, you're probably gonna have to trade your Brute or Commando into one of your aggro opponent's aggressive units, and they're not gonna be around for a Chimera. The alternative scenario is that you took your turn 4 or turn 3 to play a 2-drop and another 2-drop, or 2-drop and a 3-drop, kind of like my pilot plus 2-drop situation in my current deck. And I think in those situations, you know, maybe you play Chimera on turn 5 and you're happy, but in my experience, you know, I feel like you're probably just dying to an aggro deck. And then in the alternative scenario where you get the Chimera after you play a relief runner and a Fleet Interdictor and they're still alive, you're probably winning. And while that's nice, that's not the scenario we care about. We care about how do we keep ourselves alive to get to that scenario. If you've somehow made it 40 minutes and you're seeing the screen, good job. But here's a text blob of kind of what I think went wrong with the deck. I think if I could redraft it, I would probably scrape the Razor Crest plan, free up my pilot picks, and go more into landing shuttle and more exhaust tricks from yellow. I'm not sure if the deck would have been better, but I would be interested to see how it would have performed. And with that being said, thanks for watching and good luck in your next draft.